They laughed when Emily Carter paid cash for a rusted-out World War II plane sitting on blocks behind a rotting barn in rural Montana. Locals called it junk with wings, an old rusty plane that hadn't moved in decades, its nose buried in tall grass, its tail draped in vines. Even the auctioneer smirked when she signed the deed. But Emily didn't flinch. She knew exactly what she was buying. At 39, Emily was a war widow, a former aircraft mechanic who'd left the Air Force after her husband, Captain James Carter, never returned from his final flight. Since then, she had drifted from one odd job to another, barely holding herself together, let alone a purpose, until she found the listing. Old plane for salvage rusted fuselage, no engine, parts stripped, free if you tow. Most folks saw a scrap. She saw a whisper of something sacred. That day, under the orange glow of a dying afternoon, Emily stood before the battered aircraft, its aluminum frame pockmarked with rust, one wing missing, windows shattered, and felt something deep, electric, and still. Not just a plane, a story waiting to be retold. They didn't understand why she'd spend her last dime on something so broken. But that's because they never read the logbook she found inside. And they never knew the name of the pilot who once flew it. They said she was wasting her time. Neighbors driving past on County Road 16 would slow down, shake their heads, and mutter things like, "There goes that Carter woman again, trying to fix the Titanic with a wrench." Word got around quick in small towns, and when someone drops their savings on a rusted hulk of aluminum with no wings and no engine, it tends to light up the gossip line. But Emily didn't care. She wasn't trying to prove anything to them. She was trying to make peace with the silence. The old plane sat behind her grandfather's long-abandoned tool shed, where Emily had parked it on delivery day. It had taken a flatbed truck, 2 forklifts, and the last favor she could call in from the local towing company. The wings were still in pieces, the fuselage barely holding together. Panels hung off like bruised skin. The nose cone caved slightly inward, and half the cockpit had been taken over by wasp nests and mildew. It was, by every definition, a rusty plane in need of a miracle. But it was hers. She started with a toothbrush, scraping off grime and sand from the tail number, her gloved hands trembling slightly. There was something calming about it, like dusting off a memory that didn't belong to her, but still whispered her name. For 3 days, she did nothing but clean, no repairs, no plan, just brush, wipe, repeat. On the 4th day, she found the compartment. Tucked behind the pilot's seat, hidden under a broken flight panel, was a leather-wrapped journal sealed in a Ziploc bag. She almost missed it, thought it was part of the old wiring until the edge caught her rag. She sat down hard on the concrete and opened it. "J. Carter, flight notes." Her hands froze. James, her husband's name. But this wasn't his handwriting. The pages were older, weathered, and full of elegant cursive lines. And suddenly, it hit her this plane wasn't just a plane. It was once flown by another Carter, his grandfather, the one James had talked about once or twice, always in passing. Major Everett Red Carter, U.S. Army Air Forces, missing in action, 1945. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The journal wasn't technical. It was human. Notes on weather conditions. Drawings of a dog that used to follow him to the airfield. Poems. God. He wrote poems. And toward the middle sketches of the very aircraft she now sat beside. This wasn't just a random purchase. This was a buried legacy. From that moment on, the work changed. No longer just a rusty plane restoration project, it became something sacred, a resurrection. Emily began studying the frame measuring angles, comparing what remained with the hand-drawn schematics in Everett's journal. It had been a prototype, something custom-built for reconnaissance. Lightweight, experimental, maybe even off the books. She ordered parts online, bartered with junkyards, called up her old crew chief buddies from the service. She even drove 8 hours across state lines to salvage a landing gear from a plane that crashed in '68. If anyone asked, she said it was for a memorial. But the truth was louder in her bones. This old plane, this abandoned machine, was never meant to rot. And Emily couldn't let it die a second time. Weeks passed, then months. The sunburnt fuselage was sanded down and primed, rivets replaced, the cockpit gutted and rewired, piece by piece, bolt by bolt. The rusty shell became a plane again. She'd wake up before dawn, pour herself black coffee, and work in silence as fog curled across the Montana fields. Chickens squawked in the distance. Sometimes deer passed by, watching her work like curious spirits. And every night, before packing up, she'd sit in the cockpit, close the canopy, and whisper, "I see you, Red, I see you." The town still laughed. They posted photos of the plane on Facebook with captions like, "Rust never sleeps," and apparently neither does Emily. But they didn't see what she saw. They didn't hear the echoes she heard inside that cockpit. They didn't know what it felt like to run your hand across cold aluminum and realize your fingerprints were the first ones in decades. They didn't read the last page of Everett's journal. If anyone finds her, don't let her die like this. She was built to fly, just like her pilot. Emily cried the night she read that. She sobbed until her lungs hurt, until the Montana wind wrapped around her shoulders like a hug from the past. Because for the first time since the funeral, she didn't feel lost. She felt chosen. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the Rockies, casting gold over the still unpainted wings, Logan, the teenage son of her old neighbor, walked up the gravel path and stared at the plane in awe. He didn't say anything at first. Just looked at it? Then he whispered, "You're really gonna get this thing to fly." Emily glanced at him, grease on her face, hair pulled back in a bandana. "No," she said, smiling softly. "We are." It was a Wednesday when everything changed. The sky was the color of dull steel, wind brushing softly across the wheat fields as Emily Carter climbed into the cockpit again, just like she'd done every evening since the restoration began. Only this time, she wasn't alone. Logan, the neighbor's boy who'd slowly turned from curious onlooker to eager apprentice, was buckling into the co-pilot's seat. He'd spent the last few weeks helping her reattach the wing struts, learning to read schematic drawings, and asking endless questions about flight dynamics. Emily didn't mind. It felt good to pass something on. "Hey," he said, pointing to a panel near the rudder pedals, "what's that little compartment for?" Emily squinted. It looked like nothing a sealed panel no bigger than a shoebox. She had assumed it was just part of the old wiring bay. But Logan was right. There were tiny screw holes sealed with paint decades ago. Her stomach turned. They climbed out, grabbed tools, and carefully unscrewed the plate. Inside, wrapped in wax paper and cloth, was a small metal container, airtight, military grade. No markings on the outside. She placed it gently on the workbench. "You think it's, like, dangerous?" Logan asked, half joking, half nervous. Emily gave a dry laugh. "Dangerous, I bought a rusty old plane for $50 and a handshake. At this point, I'm hoping it's just old rations." She opened it. Inside was a stack of documents, some typed, some handwritten. Fragile, but perfectly preserved. A few pages were stamped, "Confidential, Project Haven." At the bottom was a worn black and white photo. 2 men in flight suits. One of them unmistakably Everett Red Carter, the same grin as in the photos James used to keep in his wallet. The other, not familiar. But something in his face struck Emily alert, serious, brilliant. She flipped over the photo, Red and Max final trial flight, May 45. She didn't know who Max was. But the next page told her everything she needed to know. To whom it may concern. This aircraft serial 7XH is a prototype created for Operation Haven, an off-the-record joint effort between Allied forces in 1945. Its purpose to airlift medical personnel and supplies into concentration camps immediately after liberation. No press, no fanfare, just help. When the war ended sooner than expected, the program was shelved, buried, forgotten. But Everett refused to let the plane be destroyed. Said if the world ever needed her again, she'd be ready. He maintained her in secret, paid for parts out of pocket, hid her when the base shut down. This wasn't just an aircraft. It was a promise. If you found this, then that promise now belongs to you. Emily sat there, hands trembling, heart in her throat. She looked over at the plane, the abandoned, rust-bitten husk that had once been a punchline in town. It wasn't built for combat. It wasn't a fighter or a bomber. It was a rescue bird, a restoration plane, and her husband's grandfather had kept it alive because he believed the world would still need it someday. Emily wiped her eyes with her sleeve and whispered, "You magnificent, stubborn old man." Later that night, she spread the documents across the living room floor, pages of schematics, cargo load specs, even handwritten letters between engineers who hadn't wanted the project to die. She read until her eyes blurred. Among them was a letter addressed simply to the next pilot. She didn't open it yet. Not because she wasn't ready, but because she knew, deep down, this letter marked the shift. The moment she'd stop thinking of herself as the woman restoring a rusty plane, and start becoming the one meant to fly it. The next morning, Emily returned to the hangar with a new energy in her steps. She and Logan worked in near silence, tightening bolts, rechecking avionics, replacing the main landing tire with the salvaged one they'd driven to Wyoming for. Every turn of the wrench felt different now. She wasn't just rebuilding a machine. She was restoring a mission. Even Logan picked up on it. "This wasn't a warplane, was it?" he asked softly. "No," she said, not looking up. "It was a lifeline, and we're going to make sure it becomes one again." By sunset, they had installed the refurbished yoke. It gleamed against the worn leather of the pilot's seat, two eras shaking hands in the middle of a forgotten dream. Emily finally opened the letter, to the one bold enough to bring her back. "You've already done more than most would have dared. This plane wasn't designed to kill. She was built to save. If you're reading this, then maybe the world has gone dark again. But I believe light can still come from those who refuse to give up. So don't fly her. Use her. Make them remember what we were capable of. And if anyone laughs, let them. Because one day they'll see what you did, and they'll go quiet." Emily folded the letter slowly, placed it beside her on the bench, and looked up at the old plane, still bearing the scars of rust and rain, but now standing like a monument to defiance. It wasn't a restoration project anymore. It was a resurrection. And soon, it would fly again. Sleep did not come easily after she read the letter. Emily sat at her kitchen table long after midnight, the papers spread out before her like puzzle pieces from a forgotten war. The lamp hummed. The coffee had gone cold, and the only sound was the soft tick of the clock on the wall. All her life, she thought grief was about absence, the empty chair, the unreturned call, the folded flag in a wooden box. But now she understood it differently. Grief wasn't just the silence left behind. Sometimes, grief was a weight passed forward, a torch. She looked at the photo of Everett Red Carter, her husband's grandfather, standing proudly in front of the very same old plane now sitting in her barn. He hadn't left her an heirloom. He had left her a responsibility. And suddenly, she wasn't just that widow wasting her savings on a rusty plane restoration project. She was the next custodian of a promise. The next morning, Emily drove back to the hangar before the sun had climbed above the ridgeline. Mist hung over the wheat fields, dew clinging to the weeds that had crept up around the landing gear. The abandoned plane looked almost ghostly in the half-light, half-machine, half-memory. But Emily didn't see a wreck anymore. She saw potential. Logan was already there, sipping from a thermos of cocoa, bouncing on his heels with restless energy. "You didn't sleep, did you?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not much. Couldn't stop thinking about it." "About what?" She laid a hand on the cool fuselage. About how everyone thought this thing was junk. Just an old, rusty plane not worth a dime. But they didn't know what it carried, what it meant. They didn't know it was built for something bigger than war. Logan's eyes softened. "So, what do we do now?" Emily smiled faintly. "Now we finish what he started." For weeks, her pace doubled. The restoration wasn't just about sanding away corrosion anymore. It was about bringing back a voice that history tried to silence. She treated every bolt, every rivet, every smear of grease like a prayer. Neighbors still laughed when they drove by, calling out things like, "When's that rust bucket taking off? Amelia Earhart." But Emily didn't bite. She let them laugh. Because she remembered Everett's words in the letter, "If anyone laughs, let them. One day, they'll go quiet." Each night, she climbed into the cockpit, whispering checklists under her breath, imagining the day she'd power it up. She studied manuals, cross-referenced the old schematics with modern equivalents, and even phoned a retired Air Force mechanic in Kansas who still had spare parts from the 1940s. And slowly, impossibly, the restoration plane began to take shape again. One rainy afternoon, while tightening hydraulic lines, Emily paused to catch her reflection in the aluminum skin. For a moment, she didn't see herself at all. She saw James, his stubborn grin, his hands always smelling of jet fuel. Her throat tightened. All this time, she thought her life had ended with his, that her purpose was buried in a folded flag. But this plane, the one everyone dismissed as junk, was teaching her something different. Purpose doesn't die, it transfers. And maybe James, and Everett before him, had somehow passed it down to her. She wasn't fixing a machine, she was fixing herself. By late summer, the wings gleamed with fresh paint. The propeller assembly spun true, wiring hissed with new life when tested against the console. The rusty plane restoration was no longer just a dream, it was tangible. Undeniable progress. Logan stood back one evening, hands in his hoodie pocket, eyes wide as the last tarp came off. "It doesn't even look like the same plane anymore," he whispered. Emily brushed dirt from her hands and nodded. "She's not. She's who she was always meant to be." That night, she sat down with Everett's journal again, not as a grieving widow searching for comfort, but as a woman ready to accept a mantle. The last entry burned into her heart. "They told us it wasn't worth the money. They told us no one would care. But one day, someone will need her. And if that day comes, she must be ready." Emily closed the book and whispered into the quiet. "She's ready, and so am I." For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a broken veteran living off scraps of yesterday. She felt like a guardian of tomorrow. And as she turned off the hangar lights, her hand lingering on the fuselage one last time, she knew. This wasn't just Everett's story anymore. It was hers. By the time autumn arrived, the hangar no longer smelled like mildew and rot. It smelled like aviation fuel, grease, and the faint sweetness of new paint curing on aluminum skin. The old plane that once looked like nothing more than scrap metal now stood proud in the center of the concrete floor, wings outstretched like it had been waiting decades for this moment. Emily Carter stood back, arms folded, and let herself breathe it in for months. She'd poured her soul into this rusty plane restoration, sanding until her arms ached, wiring until her fingers bled, and studying until her eyes blurred. And now, finally, it was more than a project. It was alive. Logan whistled low. If my dad could see this, he wouldn't believe it. He told me you were wasting your time. Said no one could ever bring back an abandoned plane like this. Emily smiled faintly. That's what they all said. But even as pride warmed her chest, reality pressed in. The plane could be ready, but what was the point if it never left the ground? A machine built to save lives was still just a monument unless it was put to use. And that's when the knock came. It was a Friday afternoon, the kind where clouds hung heavy and the air tasted of rain. A black SUV rolled up the gravel path to her hangar, tires crunching slow and deliberate. Emily frowned, wiping her hands on a rag as two figures stepped out, one in a pressed suit, the other carrying a military-issue briefcase. "Mrs. Carter?" the woman asked, her tone brisk but respectful. Emily hesitated. "That's me." The woman extended a card. "Department of Civil Emergency Response." Emily's stomach tightened. She hadn't told anyone outside of town about the plane, at least not intentionally. Sure, whispers spread, photos leaked on Facebook, but she never thought anyone official would care. The agent stepped closer, removing her sunglasses. "We've been hearing rumors about a restoration plane here in Wheatland County. At first, we dismissed it, but then a photo surfaced." She pulled out a tablet and swiped an image of Emily's hangar, the tail number visible through an open door. Emily's heart raced, and the agent lowered her voice. "And 3 weeks ago, a chemical plant explosion in Louisiana cut off rural towns. Roads were blocked, hospitals overwhelmed. Relief was delayed for days because no aircraft could land on those makeshift strips. We lost lives we shouldn't have lost." She paused. "That's when one of our analysts recognized your tail number. Old records, Project Haven." Emily froze. "Project Haven?" The same word stamped on Everett's documents. The agent continued. "Your grandfather-in-law wasn't crazy. These aircraft weren't designed for war. They were designed for disaster zones. Small, agile, able to land where nothing else could." She leaned in. "We could use that again." Emily felt the weight of every sleepless night, every bruise and cut, every laugh she'd endured from neighbors who swore she was wasting her life on junk. Now, suddenly, strangers in suits were asking if she'd put that same junk into service. Her first instinct was to laugh, the irony of it all. Instead, she straightened. "So let me get this straight. You want me to take this old plane, the one everybody mocked me for buying, and use it to do the job your shiny billion-dollar helicopters couldn't?" The woman didn't flinch. "Yes." Logan nearly dropped his wrench. "Wait, you mean actually fly it? Like, for real missions?" The man with the briefcase spoke for the first time. His voice was measured. "Not just missions, demonstrations. Funding is opening for civilian partnerships. We're looking for proof of concept. If your rusty plane restoration really works, you'll have the opportunity to lead something much bigger." Emily swallowed hard. She looked back at the aircraft, gleaming under the hangar lights. Just months ago, it had been nothing more than an abandoned plane, laughed at by everyone she knew. Now, it was being called into service not for war, but for mercy. The agent slid a folder across the workbench. Inside were contracts, proposals, outlines for disaster response trials. Emily flipped through them slowly, her pulse quickening with every page. At the bottom was a line marked in bold, Lead custodian Emily Carter. That night, after the officials left, Emily and Logan sat on the hangar steps watching the rain. The boy was buzzing, almost unable to sit still. "Emily," he said, "do you realize what this means? They're asking you to prove everyone wrong, to show them that this wasn't just about fixing up some rusty plane. This is about saving lives." She didn't answer right away. She just stared at the silhouette of the plane inside the hangar. For so long, she thought she was fixing metal, but maybe the metal was fixing her. And now, it had the chance to fix something much bigger. She finally exhaled, her voice low but steady. "Then we won't let them down. We'll fly her. And when we do, they won't laugh anymore." The first time Emily Carter sat alone in the cockpit after the government agents left. She didn't touch a single switch. She just sat there, hands folded in her lap, eyes tracing the gauges that now gleamed from weeks of careful work. It no longer felt like scrap metal. It no longer felt like a joke. It felt like destiny. For months, she had been mocked as the woman who wasted her savings on a rusty plane. Now, she was staring at a panel that could very well change how people saw not just the aircraft, but her. Still, the weight was crushing. She thought of Everett's words in the hidden letter. "Don't let her die like this." And for the first time, Emily whispered back into the silence, "I won't." From that day forward, her life changed. She built a schedule, rising before dawn to check systems, recalibrate instruments, and document every repair. The hangar became more than a workshop. It became a command center. Charts and notes lined the walls, a calendar filled with deadlines, fuel tests, and airframe inspections. Logan kept showing up, more eager each day, scribbling notes in a beat-up notebook, his young face lit with the kind of curiosity Emily once thought she'd lost forever. "This isn't just about fixing an old plane anymore, is it?" he asked one afternoon, watching her test the hydraulics. Emily smiled. "No. It's about proving that even when something is written off, even when people laugh at it, it can still rise again. That goes for planes. And people." She reached out to contacts, former mechanics, retired engineers, even an old squad mate who now taught aeronautics at a community college. At first, they were skeptical. Then she showed them the documents, the schematics, the proof that this wasn't just another relic of war. Soon, they began sending advice, spare parts, even money, quiet donations tucked into envelopes that arrived with no return address. One letter read, "We tried to keep Project Haven alive. They shut us down. Thank you for not letting it die." Emily pinned it above her workbench. But with progress came risk. One evening, as the sun slipped behind the Rockies, she stood with Logan watching the propeller spin under power for the first time. The engine roared, a deep, steady hum that vibrated through her chest. Logan's jaw dropped. "She's alive!" Emily blinked back tears. "She's always been alive. We just had to wake her." That night, however, she couldn't sleep. The roar still rang in her ears, but so did the doubts. What if she failed? What if this was nothing more than an expensive midlife delusion? She looked out at the hangar lights glowing faintly through the rain and whispered, "No, this isn't delusion. This is a promise." By winter, the rusty plane restoration was complete. The fuselage gleamed with fresh paint, the instruments glowed softly, and every part hummed with readiness. But something else had been restored to Emily herself. The woman who once hid from the world, ashamed of what she'd lost, now carried herself differently. Her voice was steadier, her eyes sharper. The grief hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into purpose. She no longer felt like a widow clinging to scraps of the past. She felt like a guardian of something greater. When the Department of Civil Emergency Response called again, they weren't asking for updates. They were asking for action. "There's flooding in Arkansas," the agent said. "Roads are washed out. Supplies aren't getting in. We need a test flight." Emily's heart raced. This was the moment. She hung up, turned to Logan, and said, "Get the checklists. We're not waiting." That night, as she strapped herself into the pilot's seat, the hangar was quiet except for the hum of the engine warming up. Logan stood at her side, headset in place, eyes wide. "You sure about this?" he asked. Emily gripped the yoke, her knuckles white. "I've never been more sure." She remembered every laugh, every whisper, every cruel word tossed her way when she first bought the abandoned plane. And then she thought of Everett, of James, of all the people who never got the chance to prove the doubters wrong. This flight wasn't just a test. It was vindication. The propellers spun faster. The ground trembled, and Emily felt a surge of power she hadn't known in years. She guided the aircraft forward, down the strip, the nose lifting smoothly into the night sky. As the plane rose into the darkness, the town lights shrinking below, Emily Carter felt herself rise with it. The widow who once felt broken, the mechanic who was mocked, the woman who bought a rusty plane when she had nothing else. She was gone. In her place was something stronger, a custodian, a leader, a pilot of mercy. And for the first time in her life, Emily wasn't just restoring a machine, she was restoring hope. The sky over Arkansas was painted in smoke and water. Days of heavy rain had broken the levees, drowning farmland and cutting off whole towns. Roads vanished under muddy torrents. Cell towers collapsed, and emergency trucks sat stranded miles away. Families huddled on rooftops, waving frantically to helicopters that never came. And then, against the stormy horizon, came a shape no one expected. Not sleek, not modern, not polished with government insignias, but unmistakably an old plane. Emily Carter's plane. The same rusty plane her neighbors had laughed at when she hauled it home on a flatbed. The same abandoned plane kids had thrown rocks at behind the barn. The same project people had sneered about at the diner, saying, "She's lost it. Nobody can bring a junk heap like that back." Now, it cut through the storm like a ghost awakened. Inside the cockpit, Emily's hands were steady on the yoke. The roar of the engine filled her chest, not with fear, but with purpose. Logan sat beside her, wide-eyed, relaying coordinates from the emergency tablet. "Drop Zone 1 school gymnasium roof, 5 miles east." She banked left, the rain hammering against the windshield. Below, dozens of people waved desperately, their faces pale in the floodlights of a nearby fire truck. Emily flipped the switch, releasing the first crate. It parachuted down, bursting open with food packs, blankets, and water filters. A cheer erupted below, though she couldn't hear it through the storm. She could see it in their raised arms. Logan's voice cracked with excitement. It worked. Emily only nodded, her throat too tight for words. 1 drop turned into 2. 2 became 3. At each location, supplies landed precisely where they were needed: church rooftops, a half-submerged highway median, even the bed of a stranded pickup where a family clung to hope. She wasn't just flying a machine, she was delivering life. By the time the fuel gauge nudged low, Emily turned the plane back toward the makeshift runway where emergency crews waited in stunned silence. She eased the aircraft down onto the wet strip, the tires skidding before gripping hard. The old bird groaned but held steady, rolling to a stop under the floodlights. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, a single firefighter removed his helmet, clapped slowly, and whispered to those around him, "That's no wreck. That's a miracle." News traveled faster than the storm. By morning, headlines blared across the country. Rusty plane becomes lifeline in Arkansas, floods, the abandoned plane that saved hundreds. From scrap to savior, widow's restoration plane delivers aid. Photos showed the aircraft in midair, supplies parachuting down like manna. Survivors called it the Angel Plane. And in a quiet Montana town, where laughter had once followed Emily like a shadow, silence now reigned. The same neighbors who once smirked at her grease-stained clothes now spoke her name with reverence. The same men at the diner who said, "That old bird will never fly," now lowered their eyes when she walked past. Because she had done the impossible. She had silenced them with proof. Back at the hangar, Emily stood alone that night, staring at the plane resting peacefully under the lights. Her body ached, her voice was hoarse, but her heart was lighter than it had been in years. She whispered softly to the empty air, "We did it. Red. We did it. James." Logan walked up beside her, phone buzzing with messages from reporters and officials. "You know they're all calling this the Carter Project now." "Right." Emily shook her head with a quiet smile. "It's not mine. It never was. It belongs to everyone who needs it." Logan grinned. "Still, you're the one who made them believe." She looked back at the plane, once a rusty plane restoration mocked as a waste of time, now a shining emblem of hope, and her voice steadied. "No, the plane made them believe. I just refused to give up on her." Weeks later, requests poured in. Disaster relief groups, humanitarian organizations, even retired pilots who had once dismissed her reached out, asking if they could help. The hangar, once a lonely workshop where Emily fought rust and ridicule, became a bustling hub. Tools clattered, maps spread across tables, volunteers streamed in daily. And above the entrance, Emily hung a brass plaque that read, "To Everett Red Carter, you were right to believe she could fly again." Emily Carter had once been the widow who bought a wreck. Now, she was the woman who proved that wrecks can still rise. And as long as the world had storms to fight, floods to outrun, and people who felt forgotten, that old plane would keep flying. Not for glory, not for headlines, but because sometimes the things everyone laughs at are the very things destined to save us. Anyone can laugh at a dream when it looks broken, rusted, or impossible. They laughed at Emily Carter when she spent her last savings on an old rusty plane abandoned behind a barn. They called it foolish, pointless, nothing more than scrap metal. But what they couldn't see was the heart behind the restoration. Every dent she hammered out, every wire she reconnected, every sleepless night she spent in that hangar was proof of something bigger. That value isn't measured by appearances, it's measured by purpose. Emily's journey reminds us that the world often dismisses what it doesn't understand. Yet, in the end, the very thing people mocked became the thing that saved lives. Her story teaches us this: never underestimate a dream just because it looks like an abandoned plane, rusty, worn, forgotten. With faith, sweat, and persistence, even the most unlikely restoration can rise again. And when it does, it won't just silence the doubters, it will inspire the world. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful true stories waiting for you. Click now to keep flying with us, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe forgotten dreams still deserve to soar.